Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our COVID-19 webinar follow-up series. My name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse here at Axiom Medical, and I'm also joined by Axiom's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Scott Cherry, and we also have our Chief Marketing Officer, Dara Wheeler. So welcome, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Well, before we get started, why don't I have you both introduce yourselves and just give us a little bit of a background.
Go ahead, Dara.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dara Wheeler. Like Holly said, I'm Axiom's Chief Marketing Officer. I'm really excited to be here talking about strategies around COVID testing and what's coming up. And I'm looking forward to talking to Dr. Cherry more.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Cherry. I'm Axiom Medical's Chief Medical Officer. I'm board certified in preventive medicine, public health, and occupational environmental medicine. And today, we're just going to be following up on our discussion we had last week with regard to COVID and its implications on sports events.
All right, fantastic. Well, unfortunately, Cedric Jones from the New York Athletic Club, he was unable to join us today, but you two had a great webinar last week where we talked about the offensive strategies for defensive COVID testing. And so we had some great feedback in terms of how you guys had taken the strategies utilized by the professional sports leagues and their pursuit in moving forward with play amid the pandemic, and really taking the population health management plans and applying them then to the education environment and then also work environment. So great job there. And for anybody that may have missed that webinar, it was wonderful. So if you want to see that, you're welcome to visit our website. You can just go there under the resources tab and you can view it on demand, because they shared, as I mentioned, they shared some great strategies for developing those plans, for really looking at the population health screening, looking at the testing procedures. They even covered how you would manage positive cases and looking at the ongoing surveillance. So I know we answered a lot of questions last week in the webinar, but we did have several that we weren't able to get to due to time constraints. And so we were hoping to pick back up on those today. And so I know that you both will be able to share some additional information. The first hit came from Wendy, who was asking if you're aware of any type of entity that may be creating standards for air filtration, hygiene, documentation criteria, and then also when antibody versus PCR testing should be utilized. I know that's a lot of information in one question, but would one of you like to be able to share on that?
I can speak to that a little bit.
Okay.
You know, there's a, and I actually forget what the acronym stands for, but it's ASHRAE, A-S-H-R-A-E. And when I was a medical officer for the Army, we would do a lot of indoor air quality assessments for the civil service populations of the post. And so ASHRAE would post air quality standards. And specifically with regard to COVID, there are what we call MERV standards, and that's minimum, I have to remember that acronym too, but it's minimum efficiency rating value. And so for COVID, usually the standard would be around a MERV 10 or higher, and it's really specifically those ratings specify the percentage efficiency of being able to effectively filter certain particles at the micron level, kind of like the N95s are rated. So this is for the HVAC systems, and if I recall correctly, it's MERV 13 or higher that really we're recommending for most HVAC systems to address. And so there is another whole component of that question, Holly. I don't know if we were able to put that question back up. Okay, so for antibody testing versus PCR testing, you know, so if it's for an employer perspective, we're really recommending PCR or antigen testing versus antibody testing. The Equal Opportunity Commission has advised against employers using antibody testing. I believe it's with regard to a Genetics Non-Discrimination Act, the GINA standard, that potentially there's a concern there. And so if it's an employer or some type of organizing body that may be concerned about a discrimination type posture, we would recommend not using antibody testing at all. However, just clinically, You could use antibody testing if you were looking to see if someone had been recently or in the past been infected. And so that's probably the best way to look at it. PCR testing should be utilized to confirm active infection.
Okay, great. And then, Dara, do you want to maybe speak to the documentation piece that they had asked about, the importance of documentation and how to maintain?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we've advocated from the beginning of the outbreak and pandemic has been that for employers, documentation is critical. And if you're looking at this from the employer's standpoint, making sure you've got a really solid risk mitigation strategy, especially if you're critical infrastructure or as you return to work, policies and processes, all of those different components, as you think through how you protect your employees, the documentation component becomes critical, and it remains critical as you work through this. And as we evolve through the experience of COVID, I think what a lot of employers are finding is that even if you take COVID away, they had gaps in their policies and documentation, and those gaps especially were highlighted with infectious disease in the workplace. And so things like dealing with Scott said, HVAC and different components, you may not have had a policy or clear written documentation around how to handle an infectious disease policy in the workplace. So what we're finding more and more is that employers are paying attention to this. They're going back and filling those gaps. And then they're providing a lot of ongoing documentation with their layered approaches, their risk mitigation strategy, and continuing to document as they move forward.
Okay, great. And then the next question that actually came from Brandy that was asking about requiring a waiver release for COVID-19 language for use in a club or gym facility.
I'll start with this question and then bump over to Scott if he has any follow-up.
Okay.
So when we're, and I think this was originally for Cedric, and looking at how they are screening when people come into his club and gym facilities. But I think in general, the requirement for any sort of screening or any sort of temperature check or testing, there are waivers and releases that are available. So for Axiom personally, if we're running programs, then employees do provide a waiver and a release for that information. The daily screenings that we do and the app that we use, there's a privacy component. We do not share protected information with employers, but we do share critical information that employers need to, again, protect the health and safety of their employees.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cherry, anything that you wanted to add there?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Just kind of speaking in addition to that, I think that also, when you look at it from a risk perspective, it appears that some of these facilities are also looking for legal defenses for some of the COVID-19 lawsuits. And so, when you look at the existing waivers that you may have, you may want to add some additional language to that releases your sports organization from liability from some of these communicable diseases.
Yeah, that's great point, Holly. That's absolutely great. And what we're starting to see is that lawsuits and fines are starting to be levied. And so I think that risk mitigation strategy, again, is critical that Holly's mentioning, making sure language is the language that's in your waivers and your releases are very solid, and that you are protecting your organization as much as possible. We obviously always lead with helping employees first. And I think most people are trying to lead that way. However, you do need to make sure that you have good documentation, like you said. And as Holly said, that risk of lawsuit or fine are becoming realities today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And especially also posting, you can also post some of the warning signage that's there for COVID-19 at your facility. All right. And then Danny had asked how accurate or helpful testing the water on their college campus might be as a way to track the virus.
Dr. Cherry, I'll let you take this one.
Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. I can start off on this. I might have missed the last few words there, but I do see the question, and I don't think there's really any evidence right now that there's a major concern of this virus being waterborne, especially in like drinking water supplies, and that's kind of very consistent across any biological, chemical, or nuclear threat in general. There's never been a huge concern, at least kind of broadly. And so, yeah, I feel that right now that would be, there would not be a lot of return in focusing resources right now at looking at water infection at this point.
Okay. All right. Great. And then the next one came from Greg that was asking if exposed, should you be tested and whether an antigen or PCR test would be recommended? I know there was some confusing language, maybe, that had came out from the CDC that said one thing and then kind of came back with some additional standards in terms of testing following exposure. So would one of you maybe want to take that one, both the when you should be testing and then the type of testing that should be utilized?
But Dr. Cherry, if you want to start.
Yeah, I can. Sure. And I think to address this question, it's best to kind of discuss when is testing most high yield, and then we can work back. And so what we're really seeing is testing for infection is most high yield when someone's symptomatic, and usually day 3 to 5 of symptoms. So, this question is addressing someone who's exposed, so technically asymptomatic. So as as someone becomes symptomatic, still there's lower yield from the test. So the testing efficacy is lower. The positive predictive value is much lower kind of day 1 of symptoms. And so someone who's not symptomatic at all, you have lower and lower efficacy. So someone who's exposed, we would expect them to develop an infection if they are going to develop an infection within the incubation period. That incubation period is 14 days. And so the average time someone is actually getting sick in that incubation period is day 5. That's the median time. So 50% will become infected by day 5, and then the last 50% will be day 14. And you can get 97% by day 11. But I would say right now the value in testing is more along those that are symptomatic. But there are kind of some special populations that are recommending testing at the exposure level, and obviously if the organization has a specific drive to do that, we can testing can be provided. But from a clinical perspective, day 3 to 5 of symptomatic is highest yield.
Okay. And then what about the use of antigen versus PCR testing?
So if someone has tested positive in the past 90 days, a antigen testing would be preferred, in my opinion. What we see in PCR now is if someone has tested positive previously, there is this concern for persistent positive, and that's based on the nature of the test. The PCR test looks for genetic material. So once someone is actually recovered from the disease, they will still have genetic material in their respiratory tract, and the PCR test will basically detect that material and be potentially a false positive. And so the antigen test actually looks at protein that's produced by viable virus, so you won't have that same persistent positive. The other thing we like about antigen test is that the test can be performed very quickly and results very provided kind of on site. A lot of our clients in critical infrastructure or real-time operations that need frequent testing, several times a week before, we're trying to get those results to those operational folks. Waiting a day to 3 days from a PCR test can be quite difficult and stressful for those operations.
Okay. And Dara, we're actually doing a lot of the antigen test in some of the mobile labs, correct?
Yeah, I was going to mention what Scott said at the end of his statement. I think that in terms of the initial question on whether you test if you're exposed versus symptomatic and on what day and what type, those are all really, really good questions for individuals. But what we're faced with is population health, and how do we keep populations on the job and safe? So what we're doing with all of our different approaches is continuing to layer that approach. And so we're doing daily antigen testing, which, like Dr. Perry said, has a faster turnaround time and we're able to provide on site. And then we're layering the PCR testing as an approach, but that type of testing is a more surveillance style of testing, because what we're doing is testing people who are neither confirmed exposure or symptomatic. We're doing ongoing testing to try to determine as a kind of additional layer to syndromic or symptom screening or other screenings that we're doing, to see if we can catch somebody who is potentially pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic in that population and prevent further outbreak from occurring.
All right. Well, the next question that came from Amy that was asking about categorizing sports by level of risk. Dara, do you have any thoughts about this one?
Yeah, so there's a lot of risk stratification documents that I've seen as people have kind of been able to get back into space and public space. Our local government in Texas has now opened up to about 75%, and a lot of the areas like restaurants and things like that. So risk for any individual is definitely something that you should pay attention to. And I know there's a lot of documentation out there about whether, golf is risky or going to play soccer is risky. And I do think that there are various levels depending upon the contact, how close contact you are. So if you think in general day-to-day life, we consider a close contact for COVID somebody that's within 6 feet for over 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, depending upon the resources you're looking at. And so if you're thinking about that in terms of sports, in the sports world, something like golf is very low contact. You don't have face-to-face contact with another individual. There's not heavy breathing and sweat being brought to between the two players, or if you have a foursome. And so I think also things like paying attention to whether you're outside or in a gym and things like that make a big difference. So again, obviously risk should be weighed for every individual, but the risk around golf is probably significantly lower than playing basketball, pick up a game of basketball, or I think one of the other examples there was boxing, where you would have a significant amount of effort being placed between two individuals for a significant period of time. And so that risk would definitely increase, as well as being an inside sport as well. Dr. Cherry, anything else in addition to that?
No, I agree. I liked how you addressed kind of indoor versus outdoor. That is also another huge driver. I think we're starting to see some really strong evidence that being outside is very protective of transmission. So potentially if you're going to play basketball, maybe outdoors versus indoors. And, I grew up playing golf, and so I would say depending on the stakes of the game, there may be some heavy breathing after a bad shot, but not during the actual,
Yeah. Well, and two, I think that whenever you look at some of the sports safety guidelines that are there, not only do you look at it from a, classifying the activity, so you would have the low, medium, and high, but they're also looking at levels of play. And so you may see the levels of play where you have like a level 1, and so that may be in a no contact practice, and then you see a gradual progression up to maybe like a level 4, which would be allowing tournaments or championships. So you can travel out of state. And so, where you're seeing that, you might have a high level that's going to only be allowed to level 1, whereas, a low risk, you may allow them up to a level 3 or 4. And so whenever you categorize those and you add in the play factor, I think that definitely gives you kind of the framework there for being able to scale, safely based on what's going on in the public, what the public health conditions are.
Yeah, and I do think the approaches in professional and college sports are going to be very different than your pickup game of basketball down the street. Obviously, with a testing protocol that changes the game literally for the people that are in closer contact sports, because what you're then able to do is kind of test into a population and continuously test so that you can maintain the health of the entire group instead of the individual. Sure. So what a lot of the sports, the leagues and the teams are doing is they are maintaining those different types of testing cadences. So either they're the bubble concept in the NBA, or regular testing for the NFL and for the other college athletics. I think that's one way to mitigate some of those issues or those risks components with close contact sports indoors. However, it definitely changes the risk level if you're doing it for a fun pickup game, or if it's something that you enjoy doing on a weekly basis to stay in shape and to have some fun with friends. And I've seen, I've had a lot of friends and family reach out and say, can I still do this? Or when is it safe for me to do this? My sister plays soccer, and she really enjoys playing weekly soccer games. And they were going to do a tournament in Las Vegas. And she said, okay, how risky is this? And I said, are they testing everybody? Is everybody testing into the bubble? If not, it's pretty risky. Right. Are you going to run around on the field with masks? Probably not. There's a lot of things to consider. However, it is outdoors, like Dr. Cherry said, so that does help a little bit. But everybody in an individual moment needs to weigh that risk, as well as these leagues and these different college athletics and high school athletics open up. There'll be a lot of things to think about as they consider how they manage.
Absolutely. All right. And then our final question, it came from Greg again, that was asking if testing each day was necessary whenever you consider the incubation period of the virus.
I think when you look at testing as trying to determine if someone's infected and that putting the work environment at risk, their coworkers at risk, it may not be so much the incubation period. It may be the focus is what is the degree of certainty that the organization is wanting to know if their population is infected or not, and that comes with the frequency of testing and the burden and cost of testing. I think some of our earliest clients that were requiring very frequent deep nasopharyngeal testing, once that was implemented, we realized that was a very invasive test that was almost not viable from a tolerance perspective because it's quite deep into the nose and very uncomfortable. So, the incubation period matters to a degree. COVID is a very challenging infectious disease because it has a long incubation period. As we've been preparing for other infectious diseases, like as flu season comes up, our protocols for that, fortunately, flu has a much shorter, almost a third the duration of exposure. So close contacts of someone with flu can be socially isolated for a much shorter period of time. But I think really it's the organizational intent about what's their certainty. So if they want 100% certainty of no one's infected every day, then testing every day. But that again comes with a huge amount of testing requirement. So, and just I wanted to kind of talk about that previous question briefly about exposure. And so, obviously if me and Dara are working in close contact and I become infected, and technically Dara's an exposure, if Dara gets a test that day, it actually would mean that she was infected before today. And so it's not actually me being the source to Dara today, as it would be she was infected in the past 14 days. And just to kind of give that type of, that's how the incubation period works necessarily. So anyway, those are my thoughts for that question. Yeah.
All right. Dara, anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm glad Dr. Cherry mentioned the flu season. I think that, we've talked a lot about COVID. Obviously, it's on top of mind, but I also know a lot of our clients and the people we're talking to daily are very concerned about what to do during the flu season and as winter approaches. So we've heard a lot about how to manage, as Dr. Cherry says, this incubation period for COVID is a very extended incubation period. And for our screening programs, a lot of clients are starting to ask, well, what would the difference be if somebody had the flu versus COVID? And how do we manage that since the symptoms are so similar? And so I think that that's going to be a question that's critically important for a lot of organizations and universities and schools as they kind of go into the fall and to the winter. So testing and layering approaches and making sure that you're considering that is important. And we think that, like Dr. Cherry said, as the incubation periods are different, if you get a positive diagnosis of flu, then that may change your ability to come back to work a little faster, assuming you feel better, and some other considerations. So for league, as we're in football season and a lot of the high schools are starting to kick off other sports leagues, that's another component of these risk mitigation strategies and considerations that they are all taking into account.
Good points. Excellent points. Well, Dara and Dr. Cherry, thank you both for joining us today to answer these additional questions. Any closing remarks before we conclude?
Go ahead, Dr. Cherry.
You know, I guess we continue to evolve kind of our understanding of COVID, and I heard a quote about kind of science the other day that, you know, really science is basically being less wrong each day. And so I feel that we are doing that with COVID, and it definitely has been a journey, but I appreciate everyone's interest as we conduct these webinars on COVID.
Absolutely. Dara?
I just want to thank everybody again for attending, and it's been another great live event. We are really excited to support some new initiatives and organizations to maintain operations, and look forward to talking more about it.
Perfect. Well, just a few quick mentions before we go. This next Thursday, which will be October the 1st at 1:00 p.m. Central, we're going to be hosting another webinar on the importance of effective communication with multilingual populations. So we're going to have the team from Spoken Here that are going to be joining us and discussing some of the roles and responsibilities, and then also steps that you can take to establish alternative communication methods. So if you haven't already, make sure not only sign up for that, but also you can send us your town hall questions to coronavirus@axiomllc.com. We also have a white paper that you're welcome to take a look at. It addresses how the Hollywood entertainment industry is getting back to business with a multi-layered comprehensive medical approach. This walks you through everything from mandatory zone testing with the cast and crew to the role of the health safety supervisor, etc. It even gets into some of the virus transmission and positivity rates and some of the results that we've seen there. So you can access a free copy of that publication on our website. As always, should you have any questions regarding Axiom's Check Into Work or Check Into School apps, please reach out to us. We're happy to walk you through those. So thanks again. We look forward to seeing you October 1st at the webinar.